Okay, hi everyone. I'm finally recording in my new office setup. Let me know what you think. I've got the lighting all set up. I've got little displays all set up. I've got my laptop here, so when we do editing tutorials. So that's all finally put together and ready to go. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. And for my first video coming out of my new workspace and office, I'm going to be talking to you about all things star trail. I'm going to be showing you two different methods for capturing star trails. We'll be looking at a single image method where we do a single exposure, and we'll be using the intervalometer method where we take multiple images and stack them together. And I'll be going through the pros and cons of both of these. Okay, so the first thing you want to decide when shooting a star trail is which method to use. And if it's your first time shooting a star trail, well, you might not have known that there were two different methods. But yes, there are two different methods for capturing star trails, and each one has its own pros and cons. So if you look over here, you'll see this is a single image method, and this is a stacked method where we stack multiple images together. And there are pros and cons to both of these methods. So firstly, I'm going to speak about the single image method. This is the easiest method to do and is probably the one that you will start with if you've never done star trails before. So what we do for this method is a single exposure, so pretty easy. And then we turn on our long exposure noise reduction. And by turning on the long exposure noise reduction, what we do is we shoot a dark frame. So what's important to note with this method is that the dark frame shoots for the same length of time as the exposure. So if we do a 30-minute exposure, our dark frame will be 30 minutes. If we do a 40-minute exposure, our dark frame will be 40 minutes. So this starts to show you the obvious drawbacks of this method, that you're committing quite a long percentage of your time to capturing a single image. But the pros outweigh the cons in this instance, because what happens with the single image method is because we're doing such a long exposure, we're able to shoot at ISO 100 or 200 and get a lot of foreground detail coming in. So this is a great method if you have a great foreground and you want to see all that detail, then the single image method is the way to go. It also requires a lot less processing, so you would process this exactly like you would process any other image that you have. It's just one file, and you would lift up the shadows and pull down the highlights how you would do a normal edit. And I'm going to show you shortly how we're going to edit this and what this file is going to look like. So for the single image method, we want to do a single exposure with long exposure noise reduction on to shoot a dark frame. In terms of settings, I recommend doing anything between 30 minutes and an hour. This will give you quite a nice long star trail, but going any longer than an hour, you can start to risk a little bit of overheating on your sensor, and we don't want to do that. So we try and limit these single image star trails to under an hour just to protect our sensor. But anyway, up to an hour is pretty good for the single image method. But this is a drawback of this method because it means we can't do those complete trails or those complete circles that you see in some of the photos where they shoot all night and get a complete circle. And for that, we need to use the intervalometer or multiple image method. So other limitations of the single image method are if anyone turns on the light at any point of your 30-minute exposure, the image is ruined. So if you get to 29 minutes and someone turns on a headlamp, that whole exposure that you did is ruined and you'd have to start again. So that's one of the big drawbacks of using the single image method. So if you have a risk of light pollution that could come in at some point, such as a car driving past or someone walking past with a headlamp, again, you would consider using the multiple image method, because then you could maybe kick out one of those frames and you'd still be able to salvage really nice star trail from it. So there are pros and cons to both of them. I'm going to list them over here for you, and you can read them at your own time and have a look at them. But the stacked image method is a method I like to do if I'm going to shoot very long star trails. It's also nice because I can make a time lapse from that, as well as pick out single images if I want to. So if the Milky Way is coming into my star trail, I can pick out some of those single images and use them as well. It also means I can shoot for 3-4 hours and get a really long star trail. However, putting all the images together can take a little bit of processing, and I'm going to show you how to do that in this tutorial as well. So one of the drawbacks of the multiple image method is that we're going to be shooting at quite a high ISO for each image. So we'll basically be shooting each image at a single image setting. So roughly 30 seconds, 2.8 and ISO 3200. But that means if we want to see any detail in our foreground, it's going to be quite grainy, and you might want to consider shooting a separate foreground image, such as in blue hour, or shooting a longer exposure for the foreground, do a 4 or 5 minute exposure at a lower ISO that you can blend into that foreground to not have that noise, because this image will have a lot of noise. Something else you might notice if you look comparing the two different images is that on the single image star trail, it generally looks a bit softer. There's a lot less blacks or shadows because you've done this long exposure, whereas on the stacked method, the lines look a lot brighter and a lot more contrasty and punchy because there's a lot of blacks and shadows in the image. So you might also decide to choose a different method based on the style and the look of the finished product for the star trail. Basic settings for each of the methods. So for the single image method, we want to have that long exposure noise reduction turned on to shoot the dark frame, and you can start off by using something called the rule of fours, which is a nice little way to remember the settings. So you'll do a 40-minute exposure, f4, ISO 400. So that's an easy way to remember. If you're out in the dark, you don't shoot this too often, it's easy to remember the rule of 4, 40 minutes, f4, ISO 400. And that's a good place to start. That'll give you a really nice setting and a really nice look to a single image star trail. Obviously, you need to adjust this. If you're shooting in a much darker area, you might want to bring the aperture up to about 5.6. Or if you're shooting in a place where there's a lot of light pollution, you might want to bring that ISO down to 200 or 100 even. But this you got to experiment with, and it just depends on the environmental factors. But rule of 4, very nice way for the single image method. And don't forget to turn on that long exposure noise reduction. For the multiple image method, we'll use the intervalometer. So if your camera doesn't have a built-in intervalometer, you'll need to buy a remote that you can plug in, and you'll use your single image settings for the Milky Way. I generally will use 30 seconds, f2.8, ISO 3200. That's a good baseline, and based on these settings you can take a single image and see, is it too dark, is it too light, and you can just adjust your ISO and your exposure slightly to that. And then you'll go into your intervalometer and set up however many photos you want to run. I generally run a nice star trail for about 2 hours, but you can go up to 4 hours. You can run for the whole night and do an 8-hour star trail and get those complete circles that you see. But generally I shoot between 2 and 4 hours. I'll set my intervalometer to the 30 seconds with an interval of 1 second between each photo. If you start setting it to a longer interval, like 2 seconds, 3 seconds, what will happen is you'll start to get these little dots between your different stars, and it'll look like a dotted line instead of a really smooth star trail. So you want to make sure that interval is as small as possible. Some of the new cameras you can even set to 0.5 seconds, and I would recommend doing that. So those are your settings for the intervalometer as well as the single image method. Okay, so to process these images, we will start with looking at the single image method, and then I'll move on to the stacked or multiple image method. So for the single image method, I shot this photo for 2,759 seconds, which is roughly about 45 minutes. I used f4, and because there was a little bit of light pollution in the back, I dropped my ISO from ISO 400 from the rule of 4 to 200, just to protect those highlights in my sky a little bit. So I did roughly 45 minutes, f4 and ISO 200, and I was shooting at 20 millimeters. And if we move in Lightroom into our develop mode and I just pull up the shadows, what you will see is all of that detail retention in our shadows. If I zoom in, if I just cool down the color temperature to make it a little bit more natural, I just shot at a warmer temperature, something like that, you can see on the raw file all of that shadow retention that we have. So if you have a really nice composition and you want to retain all of that foreground detail, the single image method is the way to go. And you get a really nice star trail, 45 minutes. However, it is quite short, so if you want something with a longer circle or a longer line in your star trail, you would consider using the multiple image method. But for this type of image where I wanted the foreground to sing, I think it did a very good job. And you can see just by doing some very minor adjustments, you don't have to do much editing to these files. All I did was bring up the whites and the shadows a bit and drop the highlights a fraction, and the image is basically nearly done. If you have a look at that, you can see what the image looks like, and that's with only those few minor adjustments. So if you don't like to do a lot of editing as well and you just want to have the image with the star trail, using the single image method is the way to go for you. So for the multiple image method, it's a little bit more involved in the post-processing, but it's really not that hard, and I'm going to show you how to do it. You will need to be able to go into Photoshop, so that is something that you will require. However, you don't have to do a lot in Photoshop. So if you're quite familiar with editing in Lightroom, I'll show you how to quickly go into Photoshop, put all the pictures together, and then you can come back into Lightroom and continue editing here. So at the bottom, I've got all the images that I shot using the single image method. And I basically just ran my intervalometer with a 1 second interval. The settings I used were 20 seconds, f2.8, ISO 3200, and I shot this at 14 millimeters. And if you look on the screen, I'm just running through the images, and you can see I can make a nice little time lapse from this as well. So the only difference is that I'm pointing south, and that means I'll get those star trails in. So what you want to do is you want to select all your images that you want to turn into a star trail. If your computer is a little bit slow, you won't necessarily be able to import all 200 into Photoshop at the same time, and this might crash your Photoshop. So if that happens, you might want to just import them in smaller batches of 50 or 30 photos at a time, and then just combine them, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. But make your selection of all your files with Command or Option A, and right click and go edit in, and don't click open in Photoshop, because that'll open all the files separately and that'll crash your computer straight away. What we want to do is we want to open as layers in Photoshop, and this will open all the files into one file with different layers. This does take a little bit of time. If you're opening a lot of them, like 100 or 200 files, it might take about 15 or 20 minutes to open all of them. So just for ease of this tutorial, I have already loaded them into my Photoshop. So this is my Photoshop. If you look in the bottom right, you'll see all the layers that I opened to make the star trail, and they'll all be in order. So all you have to do at this point, and this is where it's really simple, is you just have to select the top layer, scroll all the way to the bottom, shift and click the bottom layer, just so that you've selected all the layers. And then we're going to come to our blending mode, and our blending mode at the moment is on normal, and we want to just take this to lighten. And there we go, there's our star trail. As soon as we click on the lighten, it's going to show the lightest part of each previous image, which will be the stars moving across the sky. So that's how you're going to make your star trail. This is obviously a very short amount of time just for the illustration of the video, but if I shot this for 3 or 4 hours and I had all those files in here, I would almost have a complete circle going around my star trail. So what we would do then is we would right click and you would scroll down and we would click flatten image. So we just flatten all those layers. So this is if you brought all the files in at once, this is what you do, and then you would just click save and it would take the file back into Lightroom and you can continue editing. If your computer is a bit slow and you need to do it in batches, you'll do exactly what I've done now with 30 or to 50 files, and then you'll repeat the process. You'll go back to your Lightroom, select the next 30 files, right click, open in Photoshop as layers. When those are all imported, you'll flatten them like you've done with this one, and then you'll just bring all those files that you've got, those different batches, into one document. And to do that, you'll right click, click duplicate layer, and put them into a new file that you'll call Star Trail Blending or something like that. So you'll just move all of those files, those batches of 30 or 50, into your new document that you've created. You'll select all of them like I've done, change the blend mode to lighten, and then you'll combine all of those different layers. So very easy process to do, and once you've combined all of those layers, you'll click on File and Save. And once you click on File Save like this, what it'll do is if you go back into Lightroom, it will save a PSD copy of the file back into your Lightroom. And then you can go to your develop and you can do your standard editing, pull up your shadow detail, cool it down a little bit, it's a bit warm, and maybe pull some of those highlights down and pull up some of the whites and that. But you can edit your star trail now like you would normally do in Lightroom, or you could stay in Photoshop and edit there. So I hope you found that useful. I just wanted to highlight the two different methods for shooting star trails, the pros and cons of both of these methods, and how to put the files together at the end of the day so that you have a nice platform to start your editing from. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comment section below.